Good morning, everyone. My name is Haley Hurst, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Wake Forest Law Review. I am honored to welcome each of you to today's symposium on the future of death care in America. And whether you're one of the many people in this room, or you're joining us in one of the overflow rooms or one of the hundreds of people joining us virtually today, we're so excited to have you. And it's really heartening to see so many people come together and be just as invested in this topic as we are. One thing that's very notable about our symposium today is its interdisciplinary nature. While the law is going to serve as our backdrop today, this is really an opportunity to bring together a variety of different perspectives. If you look at our list of speakers for the day, it's not just legal professionals, it's funeral directors, members of the Cremation Association of North America, ethicists, and frankly, more titles than I can rattle off in the time that I have allotted. But just there's a wealth of perspective in this room. And that's representative of the fact that here at Wake Forest, we believe that progress happens whenever you are getting perspectives from a variety of directions and backgrounds. So I challenge each of you today to enter our conversations with an open mind. Whenever I spoke with Barbara from Cana last night, she promised that we could expect today to be controversial. And whenever I heard her say that, I was thrilled because we all know that change and perspective and growth happens in the spaces where we're uncomfortable and where we're challenging each other to consider new things. And so with that in mind, I challenge you to take advantage of that. Take advantage of all the people in this room who are bringing a unique background to this conversation, whether that means thoughtfully engaging in our panels or if it means just turning and talking to your neighbor during the breaks, just to have an opportunity to enrich yourself and take advantage of this opportunity. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank all of the people here today that made this possible. First, I would like to thank the Cremation Association of North America, which has very generously supported us in making today possible. As you can imagine, bringing together a symposium of this size with speakers from across the country, it requires a lot of resources, whether that be financial or in planning or in the use of networks. And Cana has, by and large, made it possible for us all to gather here today for this enriching conversation. And I would next like to thank Grace Genero and Gabby Korb. I have the pleasure of standing up here and talking to you today, but the real workhorses behind this symposium are Grace and Gabby. They have worked tirelessly over the last year, and they've really left nothing to chance. They have been diligent and made so many thoughtful contributions to this space, and I'm excited for them to have the opportunity to see all this work come together in such a special day. Truly, they've made it very easy for me just to be here. And I would next like to thank the members of the Fall 2023 Funeral and Cemetery Law class who are really helping us take this symposium one step further. We mentioned that this is an interdisciplinary exploration of the topic. And so we were able to, with Dean Marsh's help, have a class which collaborated to do research and to draft articles that are going to take the conversations we have today one step further. And so we're so thankful for those student contributions and for making this possible. Last but not least, I would like to thank Dean Tanya Marsh for everything that she's done to help us be here today. Now, I'm pretty sure everyone here probably knows Dean Marsh. She is a rock star in this field. I mean, she was in Rolling Stone very recently, and so she and that's just one of many national recognitions that Dean Marsh has within this field. But What you may not know is that she's also something of a rock star here at Wake Forest. So she is just dedicated to enriching the student experience. And she teaches first year property, decedents, trust, and estates, and the only funeral and cemetery law class in the United States. It's not offered anywhere else. That is the product of Dean Marsh's passion for this subject and her drive to make this topic accessible to the futures of the law, the future practitioners of the law. And so it's really exciting to be able to come together today and delve into an area that Dean Marsh is so passionate about when she's been so passionately supporting us. She also serves as the Law Review faculty sponsor. And so truly, none of this would have been possible without Dean Marsh's network connections and her vision in bringing us all together here today. So with being aware that I'm not who you're here to listen to today, I would like to forfeit the floor to Dean Marsh. Thank you all so much for being here today.
I didn't pay her very much to say all of that. Not enough. Thank you so much, Haley, and thank you to all of you for being here, for joining us today, either in person or virtually, for the Wake Forest Law Review's 2024 Symposium on the Future of Death Care in America. As Haley mentioned, I've been studying funeral and cemetery law for a while, for over a decade. I've had a great opportunity to attend conferences held by industry groups and regulators, and those held by consumer groups, reformers, and entrepreneurs who want to reimagine the industry. And one thing I've been struck by in all of those interactions is how insular most of those meetings are. Folks in the industry tend to talk to other people who are in the industry. Folks on the outside tend to talk to each other. And I think that leads to some understandable misunderstandings. But I've also been struck by how much people in all of these groups actually have in common. And yes, there are some people who believe that nothing has to change, that business can continue as it always has. But most people in the industry and the regulatory community that I've met understand the world is changing, that consumer preferences are changing, and that we are all better off if we can work together to try to manage that transition. It's easy to demonize people that we do not know and that we do not understand. I think it's a little harder when we all have the opportunity and take the time to get to know each other. So that's what this symposium is all about. That's what the goal is. Not to focus on our differences, although certainly the differences will come up in the course of the conversations that we're going to have today, but also to try to seek common ground, to think about what the future is bringing for all of us who care about death care and how we can meet that moment. And so hopefully to begin to lay the groundwork for some new relationships and partnerships. And when I looked at the final RSVP list last night, which by the way was 780 people, both in person and online, there are lawyers, there are funeral directors, there are academics, there are students, there are consumer advocates, there are members of the public. So I think that this is a really diverse group of people who are all open to hearing about new perspectives. And that's what we're going to try to accomplish today. So I will tell the truth that the idea for this symposium came together a year ago over margaritas in Las Vegas, as all good ideas do. And I think it's pretty awesome when you can lay out an idea that sort of came to you in the shower or something, and then the other person says, yeah, let's do that. So Barbara Chemis and Cremation Association of North America, thank you so much for the margaritas, and also for the support without which we would not have been able to accomplish this today, and also for so many long conversations and email and text strings. So this is the Wake Forest Law Review Symposium, and the Wake Forest Law Review, for those of you who are not lawyers, is a publication run by the students at Wake Forest University School of Law. So this event is only occurring because of the conversations that I had early on with Haley and with Grace and Gabby, who again said, sure, let's do it. Even though it is a fairly unusual idea to have a bunch of non-legal academics participating in the symposium, and then pairing up law students with the folks who are speaking at the symposium to co-author articles. So I think it's going to be a great contribution to the field of death care studies, but it's also a great opportunity for the students to really delve deeply into that particular topic and to get a co-authorship credit. So I'm so thankful to the Law Review for taking a chance on this, and to Grace and Gabby for all of their hard work and many hours spent in my office. And then finally, I have to say thank you to all the speakers who agreed to come to Winston-Salem and share their expertise and their perspectives with us. And I'm really looking forward to the 3 panels that we've put together today. And I'll let the moderator of each panel introduce you to the panelists on that panel. But before we get to the panels, I want to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Doughty. As many of you know, Caitlin is a funeral director and an author. She's a generator of all kinds of content concerning death care. In 2011, she co-founded the nonprofit Order of the Good Death, and her educational documentaries, Ask a Mortician, have been viewed more than 250 times. My 18-year-old son always texts me when a new video hits, as if I did not know a new video had hit, but that's nice. She's the author of 3 books, all of which are New York Times bestsellers, and we have worked on a number of projects together since we met, I think, 8 years ago, although that cannot possibly be right because we are not that old. But I always value her sharp insights, her ability to break down a problem and to construct a narrative. And she is one of the best writers. I read a lot. She's one of the best writers I have ever had the pleasure to read. And I am so grateful that she came down to visit us on her well-deserved sabbatical. Caitlin?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me in the back? You can? Great. Here we go. That's me. Thank you so much for having me. Before we start, I'm going to be a little vulnerable with you and say that I am a night owl. And at 9 a.m., I'm usually awake, but doing the Wordle in bed still. So we're going to see how this keynote at 9 a.m. goes, but I'm going to do my level best. I want to thank Tanya and Barbara for putting this together. All of the Wake Forest law students, especially Kaylee Tillett, who is my law student researcher and writing partner. And I know this conference has brought together a lot of people with very different perspectives. And that means very different opinions. And each one of us, deep in our little hearts, has a vision of the funeral industry that we wish to see going forward. But if there's one thing that I think we can agree on is that in key areas, the way that the funeral industry is regulated no longer matches the funeral industry that we actually have. And so this principle that the way that the funeral industry is regulated doesn't match the funeral industry that we have extends to mortuary school, it extends to our licensing requirements, it extends to legalizing new methods of disposition, like alkaline hydrolysis or natural organic reduction. It extends to the Federal Trade Commission funeral rule. And we in this room and online, hello everyone online, may not agree on how this issue needs to be addressed, but we can agree on this fundamental principle. And if you are thinking, everything is going fine, I don't have any notes, this might not be the symposium for you. Or maybe you think that, and by the end of the day, you'll be like, oh yeah, we really do need some help here. So I've done a lot of thinking recently in preparation for this on why I think this is that these things don't match. And what I've come up with is the idea that we've had three very distinct eras in the history of funeral care in the United States. First one between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, roughly. The second one between the end of the Civil War until the 1990s. That's where I place it. And then the third era from the 1990s until today, the present. And so as you can see from that, we are living in the third era. We are currently in the third era. We are not here today to explore the future of death care. We are already in the future of death care. I know it sounds a little like we're in the future of death care, but we are. And so for some of us, including me sometimes, we're acting like we don't know it with how things are licensed and regulated. So I'm going to briefly take you through these eras and show you why I've proposed this framework. So era one, the pre-funeral industry, spanning from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War. So as most of you know, prior to the Civil War, death work in the United States was largely women's work. It was largely based in the home. The preparation of the body was simple, it was efficient. It might be a stick wedged between the chin and the neck. It might be a tie, a cotton tie that goes up around your head to close the mouth. It might be coins on the eyelids to keep them closed. It might be a simple shroud. It might be, if you were lucky, ice to put under the body to slow the inevitable decomposition. And women were the homespun experts in caring for the dead body. There's a fantastic book by Willa Mae Cartwright who gives an account of a Black woman's life, and she talks about her mother's role as the community shrouder of the dead. She said she'd get her lantern and go any time of the day or night. We didn't know about undertakers then. If anybody died, they sent for Mama. Her and 2 other women were the shrouding women. And then what happens? The American Civil War. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the American Civil War and the fact that embalmers would follow the battles and preserve the bodies to be sent back north, because if I know anything about funeral geeks, is that we all love Civil War embalmers. That's like the time. Everyone knows about that. And even if your embalming isn't your favorite thing, you still love this era of history because it was such a key inflection point where things began to change. And it kicked off era 2. And era 2 spanned from post-Civil War really to the 1990s. And even though everybody loves Civil War embalmers, I think what is less understood is everything that happened in the years directly following the Civil War, where those battlefield embalmers began to professionalize and really started the funeral industry. So this is a process of education, of regulation, of professionalization. The National Funeral Directors Association was founded in the 1880s. And in 1886, this man, Hudson Sampson, who knows who Hudson Sampson is? Show me your hands. I'm not going to quiz you. It's not going to be like pop quiz. What's his favorite color? Okay, right. We have 2 people. And this is, I think more people should know who this man is. He was a Pittsburgh funeral director and an early innovator and leader in basically creating the funeral industry. So at the National Funeral Directors, he got everyone together and he gave this sort of barn burner of a talk, and he suggested the following things, some of which will look very familiar to you if you know the modern funeral industry. Number 1, he wanted to convince the Board of Health to pass laws requiring examinations to become funeral directors. Second, he wanted to require a funeral director to serve time as an apprentice. Third, he wanted to appoint someone to determine the fitness of applicants applying to be funeral directors. And 4, he wanted to pass a law to regulate the care and burial of the dead, the same as there is for the practice of medicine. So essentially, professionalize and regulate these new funeral directors, these new embalmers, so it would be like you would a medical professional or a doctor. And only when all of these hoops were jumped through would the public receive us as professional men. And I love this part because it's transcripted like this, all in capitals, like Hudson Sampson is sending an angry text to someone, which I've just always assumed like indicates passionate yelling on his part. Like he got at the end, he was like, receive us as professional men. And the reason that these men were gathered at NFDA is the idea that they would, quote, advance professionally and, quote, be protected financially by doing these things. Then a little bit later, the idea of the funeral director moving into the 20th century really became codified. This man, probably more of you know, Carl Lewis Barnes of The Art of Science and Embalming fame. And he wrote, if I should be asked what constitutes a funeral director, I would answer a thorough gentleman, a gentleman today and a gentleman tomorrow. And what does a gentleman do? First thing he does is he wears a clean shirt, which for an embalmer working pre-PPE is like not actually a bad idea. Second, he would use no slangy expressions. And most importantly, don't let your funeral home become a smoking room for politicians, dog fanciers, gamesters, horse jockeys, and others whose time hangs heavily on their hands. And again, also not terrible advice. Don't let all those people just hang out at your funeral home all day. Even in modern days, I think we can agree. So all of this comes to pass, and the professionalization of funeral service continues. And women at this place were not usually allowed to take the exams or to apprentice. What women had done back in era one, and for hundreds of years, thousands of years before that, was largely erased. Women still worked behind the scenes in funeral service, but women's care for the dead body was seen as like a folksy version 1.0 of proper corpse care for the dead body. In this new funeral industry, historian Cami Fletcher wrote, "Women offered unskilled labor that was only to help." So men like Hudson Sampson and Carl Lewis Barnes had this vision for the American funeral industry. And this is a few things that it involved. All men, obviously, at least ones that could be properly licensed and apprenticed. Very tough barriers to entry, meaning it was tough to get in. Licensure and regulations, school, and then the central idea of what they would offer is embalming and preserving the dead body, selling the casket for that embalmed body to go in, and then selling a series of services around that embalmed body in the casket. And this really became what it meant to be a funeral director in the United States. And this continued through most of the 20th century and became the funeral industry. And if you are someone in this room or watching online who has been in the funeral industry for more than 40 years, say, this may very well be the funeral industry that you began in. And in some places, it's still how the funeral industry works. But I argue that we have moved on to a third era of funeral service, starting in the 1990s. And I'm not sure what I want to call this era yet. I am very open to ideas from the crowd. But if you're someone like me and you're very interested in the idea of reform and these new principles, you might call it something like the reform era of the funeral industry, or you might call it more neoliberal, people choosing exactly what they want and personalized service, or you might connect it to the service economy. But whatever we want to call it, here's what I believe characterizes it. I think it's a large rise in women as the primary mortuary students and people coming into the industry, the really rapid and impressive dominance of cremation. I think it's the rise of these new disposition options like alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction and whatever else is coming from the twisted mind of body disposition fans. It's a return to some era one principles like home death care, people taking care of the dead body directly outside of the funeral system, green burials. I think it's a de-emphasis on professionalization where possible in our regulatory structure. And I think it's personalized service. So I myself am no longer as young as I once was. I'm about to turn 40 in a few months. But in my experience, the Hudson Sampson, Carl Lewis Barnes version of the funeral industry was never the funeral industry that I myself existed in. I've always existed in this era 3 of funeral industry. By the time I started working in the funeral industry when I was 23, and so young, this was already my reality. And most radical in a lot of ways, in which why I paced the change starting in the 1990s, is the rapid rise of cremation. And this is half a Cana conference after all. By 2008, when I started working in cremation, but then I went back to mortuary school, and that is when I was taught primarily embalming, even though I personally never intended to be an embalmer. I worked as a funeral director for a cremation company, and then I started my own funeral home that offered unembalmed viewings and cremations and green burials. So in a lot of ways, I think I was basically Hudson and Carl's nightmare. I told my graphics guy, I was like, I need some googly eyes on these man immediately. He was like, okay. So I was Hudson and Carl's nightmare. I was a woman who neither embalmed nor sold caskets, and yet I am allowed to walk around calling myself a funeral director. Wait until Carl finds out that I had dog fanciers and gamesters and horse jockeys hanging out at the funeral home. It'll just Bichon Frises, Pomeranians running through the prep room. Really not good. But at the same time, even though, as I argue, we are already in this third era, most of us, in many ways, still live in Hudson and Carl's world. We live in an educational, licensing, regulation framework that is completely dominated and influenced by the late 19th, early 20th century. And I would argue we need a new functional framework for this new era of funeral care. And keep in mind, no one in this room was around to create this system of era two that we have inherited, but it is our job to re-examine it and have these hard conversations and think about how we want to move forward. And this new functional framework for the future of death care, I think, is a lot of what is going to be brought up and discussed today. And I'm so excited to hear what everyone has to say. And I hope that this feels like a safe enough space to have differing opinions and strong opinions. And so with that said, I would like to propose things I like that I think Hudson Sampson would hate. So these are just 3 things that I would like to put forward as the things that I believe could have the most impact in putting us into era 3 properly. So the first thing is on-the-job training. So remember, Hudson Sampson's idea was that people who wanted to be funeral directors had to have their fitness assessed, they had to go to school, they had to be tested, they should be licensed, they should apprentice. And this intensity of requirement and barrier to entry in the funeral industry is changing, but it's not changing fast enough. When I began working in the funeral industry in 2008, everything I did for my first job in the industry, and this, to be fair, is because California has much more favorable regulations for things like this, but everything I did in my first job in the funeral industry, crematory operation, work on unembalmed bodies, and funeral arranging, all of that training was done in-house. The funeral home had to be inspected to make sure that that training had happened and everything was on file, but the training itself was in-house. And again, it was only when I then went to mortuary school that I entered this sort of Hudson Sampson regulatory world. And I think about all of the jobs and skills in our current funeral industry and how brand new practitioners are trained. Natural organic reduction or human composting, trained on the job, right? Trained on the job. Crematory operator, trained on the job or perhaps a CANA training. Alkaline hydrolysis, trained on the job or perhaps a CANA training. Funeral arranging, trained on the job. Care for unembalmed bodies, trained on the job. Embalmer, a sacred ancient art form requiring 2 years of school apprenticeship and training. Funeral director, by extension, which in many states must involve embalming, which, as we know, is a sacred ancient art form requiring years of school and apprenticeship and training. This is a huge disconnect. Is there more to learn about being an embalmer than there is just taking care of an unembalmed body? Sure. To become a really high-level embalmer takes years. Is there more to being a funeral director than a funeral arranger? That I would argue less so, that there's less a difference. But either way, the 2 years, the apprenticeships and the degrees costing thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. I would argue in this case that on-the-job training is fantastic and that it served me very well. I learned from experts on the job the same way that I learned from experts when I went to mortuary school. And honestly, in many ways, a more functional, hands-on way of doing it. We can't act, though, like this is a sensible divide, that every new job in the industry, every new job that's come up, is just something that can be taught on the job, but that the older options, like embalming and funeral directing, just need to have these huge barriers to entry. And we can't keep pretending it's the most rational way to handle it. And you will not be surprised to learn that I don't think the answer is let's add more school and licenses for the newer jobs. So the next thing that I like that's very connected that I think Hudson Sampson would probably hate is dual track licensure states. Now, I don't hear a big cheer or ooh and ah in the crowd, so I will explain what that is. So single-tracked licensure states are states that combined funeral directing and embalming into one profession. And roughly half the states follow this logic, that it must be one profession. These states are also called ready to embalm states. Thank you, David Harrington. Because their rationale is that all funeral directors should be ready to embalm at a moment's notice. And many states require funeral homes themselves to also be ready to embalm with on-site preparation rooms and sets of embalming equipment and people under their employ who have trained as licensed embalmers, which is a huge financial outlay and burden. Why I think single licenses, again, with funeral director and embalmer combined, don't work in this current third era of the funeral industry is that there are just so many places where embalming will never be on offer. I'm talking about Muslim funeral homes, Jewish funeral homes, direct cremation providers, funeral homes like the one I owned, designed to be low cost and environmentally friendly or focused, funeral homes like Katrina's, which offer natural organic reduction. None of these types of funeral homes need an embalmer on staff and hundreds of thousands of dollars of on-site embalming equipment just sitting around gathering dust. Beauty salons that offer haircuts aren't required to have a licensed nail technician on staff. That's not what they offer. Raw organic vegan restaurants aren't legally required to purchase meat lockers and industrial grills in compliance with like a ready to cook a steak law. Funeral homes should be allowed to specialize and to offer the services that they want to offer. And funeral directors should not be required to be embalmers. We have moved on to a much wider, more diverse set of offerings in funeral care. And fewer than half of Americans say that they want to be embalmed. So why does embalming so completely dominate our regulatory structure as if we were living in a world where Hudson Sampson and Carl Lewis Barnes are still speaking at NFDA? And I'll flip the hypothetical here. What if I said that every funeral home had to be ready to compost? Every funeral home had to have the ability to be ready to compost or naturally organically reduce a dead body to soil at all times. I think a lot of funeral directors would say, I think composting is a fascinating new option, but I don't intend to offer that option. And that is fair. You should be able to say that. But why are funeral homes not allowed to say that about embalming? That it's an important offering that should be available to families if they want it. We just don't intend to offer it here at our funeral home. Are we not allowed to say that just because embalming is an older option? An option that's been codified and regulated to the point that it's inescapable? We know it's not inescapable because the other half of the states are dual licensure states, where you can be a funeral director without having to be an embalmer. And in some of those states, you can become a funeral director with a test and not have to go to mortuary school at all. Now, today in mortuary schools, more than 75% of new enrollees are women, and only 10% of new student enrollees come from parents who worked in the funeral industry, which, if you know anything about the history of the funeral industry, is a big change. And we talk a lot, and we'll probably talk today, about why we have such a high dropout rate in the industry after mortuary school. And I think it's because we are radically overtraining people at great expense and then spitting them out into careers that don't have as much and aren't delivering in the terms of salary or even like personal meaning structure around it. The American Board of Funeral Service Education said recently that there were 1,500 mortuary school graduates in 2023. That's 1,500, 1,500 mortuary school graduates and 5,500 jobs. So that cannot hold in the long term. These numbers aren't going to work unless we are considering alternate versions of licensing where the bare minimum is that funeral directors and embalmers are licensed separately. And another option is to go even further, perhaps to inspection over licensure. Now, some of you are bristling and you're thinking, didn't you see what's going on in Colorado? How can you say that? So in 2023, a Colorado funeral home made national news after over 200 dead bodies were found stacked in piles around the property. Some of the deceased had been at the home since 2019. In some cases, loved ones received ashes that were not actually their loved ones. This was brought to me especially since in national news originally reported this as if all 200 of these bodies were awaiting green burials, which anyone actually in the funeral industry would know it was far more likely and turned out to be true. They were waiting for cremations that did not come. These two chuckleheads took payments from families that were meant for cremations and instead bought vehicles. They bought cryptocurrency. They bought $1,500 dinners in Las Vegas and other things for themselves. And one of the big points of fallout from this incident is that large publications like The Guardian were quick to point out that Colorado is the only state without a state board overseeing funeral practitioners and licensing them, and stated, quote, "It exposed the particularly weak oversight Colorado has over its funeral homes. The state does not require routine inspections or minimum requirements for operators." I think it's very easy to say here, this is exactly why we need the funeral world to work as Hudson Sampson wanted it to. This is exactly why we need training and licensure for funeral directors. But my problem here is that training and licensure did not prevent this. In fact, this man, John Halford, who operated the funeral home with his wife, was a licensed funeral director. He was a licensed embalmer, and he worked in the funeral industry for years and years. An extra 30 hours of embalming practice would not have prevented this catastrophe in Colorado. However, regular and rigorous state inspections perhaps would have. So we need to de-emphasize licensing and emphasize inspection. State funeral boards create minimum standards that all funeral establishments must abide by to remain operational, but honestly, often there can be little enforcement in that area. As an example, the South Carolina Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation performed an in-depth 2019 analysis on its state funeral board inspectors, the ones going around to look to make sure funeral homes are keeping it ethical. They reviewed 578 funeral establishments and found there is little to no documentation of what they do when they inspect establishments. There's little to no action taken when an inspection uncovers violations, and there's no real guidance from the board on what constitutes a passing inspection or a failed inspection. And in many cases, the passing criteria sort of depends on who shows up that day to look at your funeral home. and it depends on the man or woman conducting the inspection. And when a funeral establishment was found in violation and did fail the inspection, quote, there was no procedure in place for the board to be able to act. So if state funeral boards aren't able to enforce the mandatory requirements that they put in place for funeral establishments, then inspectors kind of become superfluous. If we flipped the system as it stands and we put emphasis and resources on inspection as opposed to licensing and these huge barriers of entry for young people potentially entering the funeral industry, it would help eliminate the barriers to entry while encouraging funeral board action in these areas like Colorado, where harm to actual families and consumers is most likely. So the idea being you can enter the funeral industry relatively easy, but we have a high standard for you to be able to stay. I haven't even started to touch on a quarter of what will be discussed today, but I think, remember again, we are not looking towards the future today. We are smack dab in the middle of the future, and we now have to figure out what licensing and regulation, if any, we keep from the era of Hudson Sampson, and what we bring into the future with us for the funeral industry that we already have. Thank you.